Crazy
Who was
stuff.
it? I'm sure. Again, all these stories are coming to mind now, and I don't know if this is true or not, but they flew someone in just to overdub a hi-hat.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Inside the Mix podcast. This episode is the second installment of a listener question submission format that myself and my co-host today, R9, Tim Benson, started in episode 175. So that was the New Year's episode for 2024, which turned out to be the most popular episode in its first 7 days ever. So it's the most popular episode. So do go check out episode 175 if you haven't done so already. So this is really following on that format whereby you, the listeners, submit a question and we basically attempt to answer it, essentially. So before we dive in, if you have a question that you want to feature on the podcast, please do click the link in the episode description. It's a SpeakPipe link. All you need to do is submit your question using your mobile phone. You don't need an account. You don't need a fancy studio setup. It's like sending us an audio message and just say, hey, it's XYZ. My question for Mark and R9 is, and also give yourself a shout out as well. If you've got something happening, musical, anything along those lines, you can put that in there and it's evergreen content. So do click the link in the episode description and submit a question for myself and R9 to answer in a future episode. So that's my ramble to begin with. R9, Tim, how are you today?
I'm not bad, thank you. Yeah, a little bit buffeted, but I'm all right.
Yes, we were just having a discussion off air, as they say, about the Southwest being buffeted by a storm and repairing fences and stuff.
Yeah.
And being on the coast as we are, because we live relatively close, we are frequently buffeted by wind. More so you than me, to be honest, because I'm on the south coast and you're on the north coast.
It's been a bit wild and woolly around here, but we're all good. Yeah,
that's good to hear. It's good to hear. But it's storm season. I think we were discussing, isn't it? You kind of give a storm a name to make it feel less impactful, but it really doesn't. It doesn't.
No, storm bastard would be more accurate.
Yeah, just a swear word from each letter of the alphabet for a storm. Anyway, we'll dive into the question. So this format it's going to be a question, and basically we're just going to bounce ideas back and forth. So here we go. I'm going to play this question. I'm going to make sure it's at the beginning, as you never know how these things are going to react when you play them. So let's give it a go.
Hello there. My name is Xander Phillips. I'm a guitar player by trade, I guess. And I play mostly kind of 80s hard rock style music, kind of like Van Halen, kind of like Journey, kind of like Queen, that kind of thing. My question today is about when you start a new project and you're trying to replicate a style, like something like the 80s. There are so many effects and it's so easy to get lost. What would you put in on every track? What would you put on for a little bit of sparkle here and there? And what things would you completely stay away from? I know as a beginner, it's very, very difficult to find what you're doing. So my question's all about that today. If you're interested in the kind of thing I do, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok as Xander himself. That's Xander with an X, not a Z. And you can find me on Spotify as Xander Phillips. My latest song is a copy of the Marc Bolan song, Bang a Gong, Get It On. Anyway, hope you can answer my question today, and all the best.
There we go. Thank you, Xander.
Good question.
It is, isn't it? It's very well put as well, I must say. Very well spoken. It's a very good question. I like the influences you mentioned in there. I'm a massive Journey fan, so as soon as you said Journey, I was all in there. And 80s replication. Now, for me, when it comes to sort of emulating and replicating a style, and this is something I've been doing recently with this foray into sort of melodic house that I've been doing. As hands in the air, it's not something I've previously done. But this, I suppose it doesn't really answer the question about sort of adding sparkle to a track. But one thing I like to do is if I'm moving into the realm of like emulating a style, I get quite analytical with it. I'll get a reference track, I'll chuck it into the DAW, and then I will literally break it down in terms of section and map it out. So verse, chorus, pre-chorus, middle eight, etc., and map it out like that. And then I break it down even further. And the great thing is now we have stem splitters. and then I can then break it down in terms of what the individual elements are that they're using in that track. And then I go even further, and I use something like TDR Prism, and I'll start using low cut, high cut filters just to work out what frequency balance is going on in these different areas. So again, it doesn't really answer the question of like the sparkle side of things or what instruments or maybe effects I would use. But I think it's really important to start just to get to grips with the composition of the track and how it's structured and the frequency balance of the track. I think before you even start thinking, okay, well, what saturation plugins am I going to use? What reverb plugins am I going to use? Just break it down in terms of actually how is this structured? What instrumentation are they using? And frequency balance. I think that's specifically with what I'm doing at the moment with melodic house, because kick and bass. Now, really, and I think everyone that I do gets a bit better because I'm understanding more and more the relationship between kick and bass in that particular genre. So that would be my sort of immediate tip off the back of that. I'll throw it over to yourself now, Tim.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to start at, because getting the arrangement and the instrumentation and, you know, the playing and all those things right is so important, because you can sort of grab all the plugins you like, but if you don't get the sort of essence of the music right, you're not playing a song that fits to the genre in the first place. Then that is going to be difficult. I think it'd be quite good as well to sort of look at what was around in the 80s, what you actually had in terms of recording technology and what you could do, because of course we now are in a completely different time where we've got almost unlimited tracks and unlimited processing. And back in the 80s, I mean, it's particularly if you're looking at the rock genre and big rock bands at the time, which I know Xander was sort of saying he's sort of into that kind of thing, Van Halen, that kind of journey. They didn't record in cheap studios. They recorded in very expensive studios. It was extremely expensive to make records at that point, but they would normally be looking at, I think it's a defining thing of the 80s, that you've had live elements, quite a lot of live elements in those kind of tracks, particularly rock music. Could be live drums, live bass, live guitars and vocals, maybe with some synth elements. I think Journey has that, Queen has that,
Van Halen,
synth or keyboard elements in there. So that's the kind of general sort of, place you want to be aiming for, I'd say, and instrumentation. But then I think sort of trying to work out how many tracks you need, like trying to work out like things like they did do things like double tracking of vocals, double tracking of guitar parts, where they'd actually re-record the parts multiple times, and that kind of thing. That was in, but again, they didn't have unlimited tracks. They'd probably be recording on 24, 32 tracks.
Yeah, that's
so
what I was gonna say.
You kind of want to work within that, I think. Give yourself a bit of a framework as to how much you're working within. Not go, oh, well, I'm just going to do a 72-track thing, because that would be quite unlike the genre in a way.
Yeah. You kind of want to force, like, limitations on yourself. Like you mentioned there about, like, the 24, 32-track, maybe 8 groups, like you can bus out to. Oh, no, sorry, 8 send effects, basically. And then use groups as well. Think of it in terms of, like, you've got a console. You've got, like, an audio console or something in front of you, and force those limitations on you. That way you're sort of thinking in the mindset of they may have done in the 80s. Now, like you say, I mean, the studio spaces they have to record, you might not have access to, in particular the rooms and stuff. But, I mean, that's where I suppose you could use your emulations to do that. But I think forcing limitations on yourself to work in the scope that they would have done in the 80s. So rather than just have every synth VST at your fingertips that you could go through, if you know a particular song you're interested in, it's got a DX7 in it, find a DX7 emulation and just work with that, or maybe one other synth. But I think limitations can force you to think outside of the box and also be more creative. And I think also, I find this, if I put limitations on myself, I generally finish songs quicker. Or at least I get to a point where I'm happy with it quicker, I think.
Yeah.
Don't know about yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think if you start thinking of what you'd have, because I know it is bewildering. We've got so many effects and so many places to start. But I think the general thing with most of that stuff was it would be recorded on tape. So they were working to tape, and then it would come through a console, probably an SSL console, and there are lots of good SSL emulations out there. You don't necessarily have to use one, but like you could use an SSL channel emulation maybe to work on. But essentially, the thing would be it would have EQ, wouldn't it, and a basic dynamics thing. And while I was looking into it, and like dynamics processing in those times, they didn't really make everything pump like the way that we do. It tended to be much more subtle. There was EQ and compression on most things probably on the channels, but I would stick with EQ and basic compression, like maybe VCA compression if you've got something that's similar to that. Like, and then you would be replicating something similar to what the studios were working with, and then you've got to think maybe further out of that onto sort of time-based effects. But like, again, things like autotune that we have now didn't exist in the 80s, so you wouldn't be using autotune on all your tracks. You wouldn't be like on your vocals, you know. There's some things like that you didn't have. But digital reverbs, digital delays were very in, you know, and not as complex probably and realistic as some of the ones we've got now, but like algorithmic reverbs. And it was so you've got a fairly, for a lot of us, it's probably stripping back and going to sort of less in a way, although they did love their reverbs and delays, and they did love chorus on everything. So, you know,
I was going to say about the reverb there, like without the auto tune, being able to sort of manually tune a vocal, just swamp it in reverb. Do loads of takes. Loads of takes, and then swamp it in reverb. What band was it? I don't know if it was Rat. It might have been Rat, but I remember the vocalist from Rat had a lot of reverb on his vocal. Others might. I mean, that might be a sweeping statement. I'll probably get corrected on that, but I do recall hearing, washed with reverb when the vocal
of course,
wasn't as strong, let's say.
Of course, bands like Journey and, I mean, probably Van Halen too, but like definitely Queen and Journey, like that he mentioned, like, I mean, just stunning vocalists, weren't they? I mean, they were just really, really good. I don't think anyone would have worried about whether they had autotune for Freddie, you know. It's just like so. And to be honest, all the musicians in those bands, stunning musicians. So a lot of the sound came from just that. But then, you've got like things like gated reverb, which is a huge signature sound of the 80s, and like setting up a send to a reverb and actually putting on a nice reverb, say an AMS. You can get AMS VSTs now that can replicate the AMS stuff, and then there's Lexicon stuff as well, Lexicon reverb, so Lexicon 224. So something like that, a good algorithmic reverb, or something that emulates a Yamaha SPX90 or a quad reverb, something like that, and then an actual gate after that on the channel, and then keying the gate from sidechaining it from whatever you're putting through it. So if you're putting the snare into it, sidechain it from the snare. And, you know, you can actually replicate then a very accurate gated reverb sound, like just get a big hall sound on the reverb, but then actually gate it using an audio gate triggered from the snare itself or whatever, and you would get close to that kind of gated reverb sound, which is so signature, isn't it?
Yeah, I love the gated reverb sound. I remember when I first got into music production, and the first thing I wanted to do was create a gated reverb on a snare, and it was like the first thing I ever wanted to do, just to get that that snap and then that wash of reverb and that just huge sounding snare. I love a gated reverb, and you'll find, I think, I know I use Valhalla reverb, and I'm fairly certain there's a gated.
They've got gated presets, haven't they? And that might be an easier route than going the whole sort of thing. So you could actually use a gated sort of preset.
It's interesting you mentioned gates, because I guess, like, I mean, I've primarily now doing the synth music and as I mentioned earlier, moving into like house and stuff, getting a bit off the question here, but I find myself using gates less and less. I guess that's because I'm not recording live drums, for example, or a live outfit. I guess if I were, I'd be using gates more, but
you've got samples and stuff, so you don't really need them.
trying to think of the last. Maybe for I've maybe used it to create a stutter effect. That might have been. I might have used a gate in that instance. But yeah, it's interesting. Maybe
But
in
I
my
guess
next production, I'll try and use a gate a bit more creatively.
Gate a bit
See what I
more.
can do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess in the 80s drum stuff, it was a lot of the time, in the 70s, we'd have more like kind of Mikey of drum kits with like sort of, a kick drum mic and then like the Glyn Johns
Yeah,
kind
I
of
was just gonna
style
say
thing.
the three microphones. Yeah.
Sort of two overheads and one on the floor, tom, whatever, So you got that kind of sort of style of miking that was just miking the room and the drummer in the room, and obviously they often had quite controlled, dead sounding rooms. But then in the 80s, they started going for these big sounding rooms.
Yeah.
But then the actual close mics were on all of the drums and all of the toms were close mic'd. And then they gated them. They did gate them a lot in the actual mix. So they'd have the overheads and the room mics, but they'd have really sort of quite shut down kind of, gated close mics. And that produced a particular sound, plus the kind of gated reverb. And you get that kind of it almost sounds mechanical, doesn't it? Like a lot of 80s drums sound big, but like almost like programmed. I've almost got that kind of sort of big monstrous sound, but then it's not very natural. It's sort of slightly overblown,
Reminds me of a story. Was it John Bonham? It might have been John Bonham, and recording some Zeppelin drums, and they did it I can't remember if it was the bottom of a stairwell or something like that. But to get that huge, I mean, that's going to like 70s production. But to get that huge Led Zeppelin drum sound, I could not tell you how they mic'd it up. But I remember hearing a story along those lines where they did that, which I thought was super cool. I'd love to have the ability to do that. I suppose I could go rent out a studio and like do it that way. But
bizarrely enough, like that very John Bonham story, they actually recorded that up the road from where my studio was. When I had a studio, literally about half a mile down the road or something, was the house that they recorded that in sort of church, sort of Greyshot way, over there. And they recorded it in this sort of mansion thing, and I believe they sort of hung a mic from the top, into that, and it just gave that enormous sound when he played. So cool. That's very different than the 80s thing where they stuck you in a sort of studio and it all got. I mean, in the 80s they did strange stuff like even overdub the hi-hats separate to like the rest of the stuff, crazy stuff.
Who was it? I'm sure. Again, all these stories are coming to mind now, and I don't know if this is true or not, but they flew someone in just to overdub a hi-hat. Because they were, was it Copland from the Police?
Right, yeah.
It might well have been. This might be like one of those programs where it's just, like turning it up to 11 on Spinal Tap. It might be a story like that, where they flew someone in just to overdub the hat. And that was it for a drum kit. Imagine if you were that well known for your hi-hat that you were flown in to do that.
I know that Brian Eno used to get hired, like how he got in production, like one of his sort of ways of earning money was like getting hired to program DX7s because nobody knew how to program them.
Wow.
So
that'd be so cool.
They could get the kind of standard bell sound, and after that they were all stuck, so they'd call Brian in and Brian would program it to do, well, knowing Brian, it was just a really slow pad, but Brian, can't you make it do anything a bit more exciting? Oh no. And but no, so it's weird though. We sort of think of like having a billion presets, but people didn't. They were sort of very limited really with a lot of their sound choices. And of course you got sampling coming in at the end of the 80s, which is sort of Fairlights and stuff. So
I was thinking that when you mentioned there about the drums, like becoming mechanical, and then kind of like I suppose it depends on which genre of music you then move into, but then if you start going down to like the synth pop route and like the more electronic route, and then the drums become very mechanical. But
definitely.
And then you hear the crossover into, like you mentioned there about like with Van Halen and Queen, where they're bringing in the synthesizers. Obviously Jump being a prime example of how synths then make that crossover. So all very interesting. So part of Xander's question, thinking back to it now, was what you wouldn't do.
What you wouldn't do.
And immediately I'm thinking, now I don't know if would you do this if you were doing that, but you see sidechain compression used a lot.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Don't sidechain compression.
Pumping sidechain compression, no.
That'd be
You see
my
that a lot.
immediate thought.
You see that a lot in synth wave and synth pop, don't you? But I don't think that. I mean, stylistically, it wasn't an '80s thing. It didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't really happen. So certainly not in the rock music either. You know.
Yeah.
I think the other thing you'd be wary of is too much bottom end, because it's shocking when you listen back to those tracks how little bass a lot of them have in them. I mean, you might get the drive of the bass guitar in a Van Halen track, but you won't get that real low sort of sub end. You know, like it's not like listening to sort of Limp Bizkit or something, where like you've got an enormous amount of sub end in a rock track. Like you simply, and like a lot of the metal that we've got now, where there's a lot of low end in that sort of stuff. Like we're talking about classic rock, and classic rock just doesn't have that amount of bottom end in it. It's kind of very controlled and tight, and there is definition to it, but it's not really much past 80, sort of 180, sort of maybe 60 at the most. Do you know what I mean? It rolls off a lot, I think.
I think that goes back to what I said right at the beginning about like actually looking at particular frequency bands or particular sections like sub bass, bass, low mids, high mids, and so forth, and actually seeing what's happening there and using a frequency analyzer to see what's happening. And obviously, I mean, you're not going to do it verbatim and think, well, my frequency balances do exactly match, but you'll get a good idea of what's down there and what's happening.
Yeah, and I mean, guitars, like, again, that sort of choosing the kind of amps that they would use, like, Marshalls or whatever, that gave you the JCM sort of Marshall sound that had that kind of very, it's a tight sort of punchy sort of mid sound. It's not very low end, it's not very top end. It's kind of just like, it's sort of sitting your guitars in the right place and your bass in the right place. A lot of another thing that I was thinking that might be kind of useful if you're doing 80s stuff is thinking about some of the kind of clean guitars is actually DIing them, because bizarrely enough, that was quite an 80s thing, was to DI guitars, just plug them straight into the desk and record them if they're clean, not if they were driven, but like, a lot of like, I mean, all the stuff on Let's Dance, for instance, they just plugged it into the desk. You know, so,
I think
that was Nile Rodgers. But,
the good old Nile Rodgers. I think it's a matter of course. I've always DI'd guitar. I have a splitter, and I've always recorded a dry signal for guitar and bass as well. I think it's just been drilled into me throughout time. It's like just to have it as a backup for whatever reason. But yeah. And more so now because I'm fully in the box. So a long time since I've actually had an actual amp. I think the last one I had was an orange. Great amps, great clean tone with an orange. But DI all the way. Most certainly. I think, like I say, I'm a firm believer in just capturing that raw sound. Just gives you a bit of flexibility.
The other thing I wouldn't do is have loads of stuff running on the master, on the mix bus, because I would have it fairly simple, like an SSL bus compressor, which would have been on the desks, maybe.
Great compressor.
But great compressor, and a lot of us use that now anyway, but like just wouldn't have loads of heavy limiting and that sort of stuff, because they would do a bit of that in the mastering, but like, it was very little of that was used. You wouldn't have limiters everywhere. You just have subtle compression, EQ, some nice reverbs, delays, some chorus on things, but maybe a bit of phasing or flanging. They do like a time-based effects on stuff, but short of that, I don't think you're dealing with a lot else, and you probably only want I think we've said this before actually, only 4 or 5 reverbs maybe, and all on sends and in when you're mixing, so that you don't have tons and tons of reverb of different types of reverb.
And then it gets into this big ball of mud. I mean, that's quite extreme. It's quite extreme. One thing I was going to add as well is, and it could, I think when you first start trying to emulate a particular style and you do this research, into the different production techniques and the instrumentation and stuff that's used, and then you try and shoehorn it all into one song. I think I've learned this probably the hard way. Is like if it's a particular genre and style of music that you're going to be working in for an indefinite period of time, is try not to do everything all at once. Maybe like research 1, 2, maybe 3 different techniques, and try them out on a song, get that done, get it finished, then move on to the next one.
Yeah.
So, and then just gradually build up that arsenal of techniques, production techniques for that particular style of music, rather than trying to do it all at once. It's kind of like if you try and do it all at once, you're not really going to master any of them. Again, might be a sweeping statement, but just like 1 or 2 at a time, release that, move on to the next one, and just gradually get better that way. Because I've done that when you're thinking, oh man, I've got to get all these different techniques and these different sounds in there. But
yeah.
Going back to limitations again.
They did take their time as well making a lot of those records.
Indeed.
Like, Pyromania or something. It didn't happen overnight, like a lot of those kind of Def Leppard and that sort of thing. They spent forever making those incredible records. A lot of them are very hard records to emulate in that sense. You're not just going to all meet round someone's place, record it into a DAW in an afternoon and it just sound like that, I don't think,
Yeah. I was going to say they're probably fueled by various substances to keep it going, but I'm not going to condone that as part of the creative process.
No, just take loads of coke. That'll solve the problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was, wasn't it? It was Black Sabbath or something who said the bill for the cocaine was more than the recording.
Indeed, yeah. It reminds me of when
not a good idea.
I had the opportunity to do a quick mix on a desk, Gus Dudgeon desk. And,
wow.
It was good.
Elton John and
yes, yeah. It was previously owned by Robbie Williams, if I remember rightly.
Right.
And then there was an elephant on there, but there was a mirror that was specifically on there for a particular purpose. And that was quite interesting. I didn't use it for that purpose. I used it for mixing.
There was an elephant on there.
Yeah, and a mirror near the elephant. Oh, a
not an elephant on the desk, because that would have made it hard to work on. I can't get around the trunk.
Yeah. Oh, that would be such a great mixing session. You're just all quiet in the booth and suddenly it's like...
Don't mention the elephant in the room. Right, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I whenever I start talking about techniques and production techniques, it triggers in my head various experiences I've had along the way and stories I've been told and heard. Some of them can be on the podcast, but maybe some of them not. But there you go.
I was very lucky to actually work for a whole weekend in Genesis studio recording
Is that
a
in
client. No, it was Genesis's studio. That's Peter Gabriel's got one down there, but it was Genesis's studio just near Chiddingfold when they were at a place called The Farm. And my client actually knew the engineer there, Jeff, and he got us in for the weekend. And we just basically had that. I couldn't really believe it. I think I sort of spent most of the weekend pinching myself that it was actually happening.
Yeah.
And at some point, I was just sitting there behind their enormous SSL, recording my drummer, who was in the same room that Phil Collins had recorded, and recording all these sort of things. And I just, at this point, I remember the engineer going like, "Oh, well, you've got this, haven't you?" And just leaving me in charge of this enormous SSL desk.
Nice.
And I just thought, I don't know what I'm doing here. It was just so much amazing equipment. And in fact, it all worked out fine. But it was just incredible. And it's that thing, classic 80s records, classic stuff recorded there that I loved, some incredible Genesis stuff recorded in there, like tracks like Home by the Sea that I'm an absolute massive fan of. So, so you're just in a place where you didn't imagine you were going to end up, but it's kind of the vibe of it kind of crept onto the recording. I think it was good.
I think it does, doesn't it? You kind of get it inspired by your environment, knowing who's been there and what they've recorded before. You can't help but get inspired by that. So I suppose that in a way that could also be a tip. I mean, it's easier said than done, isn't it? Just to think, I'm just going to rock up at someone's studio to get inspiration. But I mean, if you've got it, then use it if you've got that access. Could be good doing something like that to actually
go to a studio and track the stuff and then mix it yourselves afterwards and add additional things, so that you've got that kind of more of a band vibe, if that's the way you make it. But then, of course, some people, I don't know, Xander maybe records on his own, and if he's just recording all the parts himself, then maybe that's not necessary, you know.
Yeah. Just another thing to consider. So there we go, half an hour. So Xander, I think that has answered the question in some way, shape or form. So I hope that was useful. And if you do have a question that you would like Tim and I to attempt to answer on the podcast, please do click the link in the episode description, submit that SpeakPipe audio message. Remember, hey, it's XYZ. My question for Mark and Tim is, you can find me at, and whatever you've got going on, submit that. Alternatively, I didn't say this at the beginning, if submitting audio is not your thing, just ping me an email, mark@synthmusicmastering.com, or follow me or DM me on Instagram at Inside the Mix Podcast. Either way, do submit and get featured on the podcast. There we go. Tim, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me on this.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Cheers for
We'll do it
asking
again
me.
soon.